On the afternoon of April 19th, 1775, the British Army was running. Not marching, not withdrawing in good order. Running. A few hours earlier, these men had marched out of Boston as an elite force of grenadiers and light infantry. They had been sent into the Massachusetts countryside to destroy a hidden stockpile of colonial weapons. It was supposed to be a quick operation and destroy the supplies and back to Boston before the rebels could react. Instead, the British found themselves trapped on an 18-mile road. Every hill became a firing position. Every stone wall became cover. Every farm became a potential ambush. And with every mile toward Boston, the British column became weaker. By the time they finally reached safety, hundreds of men were dead or wounded. The expedition had not conquered anything. It had not even accomplished its mission. It had simply survived. So how did Britain's soldiers become prey on an American road? The answer began the night before. General Thomas Gage was under pressure. As Royal Governor of Massachusetts and commander of British forces in North America, Gage was expected to restore order in Boston. But outside the city, the situation was getting worse. Colonists were collecting muskets, gunpowder, cannon, and military supplies. And one of the largest stockpiles was believed to be in Concord, roughly 18 miles northwest of Boston. Gage had information from an intelligence source inside the colonial movement. The weapons were there, so Gage planned a surprise raid. Around 700 soldiers would leave Boston during the night under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. They would cross the Charles River, march to Concord, seize or destroy the military stores, and return before the countryside could organize. Speed was everything. The British commanders believed secrecy could make up for distance. If the colonists did not know the troops were coming, the British could reach Concord, destroy the supplies, and disappear before resistance could form. But that assumption was already collapsing. As the troops moved through the darkness, alarms began spreading from town to town. Riders carried the warning. Church bells rang, signal guns fired, and ordinary farmers began reaching for their muskets. The British were no longer moving through a sleeping countryside. They were walking into one that knew they were coming. And the deeper they marched, the more people were waking up behind them. The British column had already lost precious time. Their boats landed in difficult ground, and the soldiers struggled through wet terrain. Before the march had properly begun, many had spent hours waiting in darkness. By the time they finally started moving toward Concord, they were already tired. But there was no turning back. Their orders were clear. Reach Concord, destroy the supplies, return to Boston. Around 5 in the morning, the British column reached Lexington. Waiting on the village green were roughly 70 colonial militia. They were badly outnumbered. Their commander, Captain John Parker, knew it. His men were not prepared to defeat the British force. They were simply standing their ground. Then the British appeared. Orders were shouted. The militia began to disperse. And then a shot rang out. Nobody could agree afterward who fired it. But within seconds, British soldiers fired into the militia. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists were dead. Several more were wounded. The British had lost almost nothing. It looked like a British victory. But Lexington had created something far more dangerous than a battlefield defeat. It created anger, and behind the British column, thousands of armed colonists were now moving toward the road. The British continued toward Concord. They reached the town around 8 in the morning. Smith divided his force. Part of it moved toward the North Bridge. Others searched for the colonial supplies. But the British had arrived too late. The colonists had already hidden or moved much of the weapons stockpile. The raid was producing almost nothing. The British had marched 18 miles for a target that was rapidly disappearing. Then smoke began rising over Concord. British troops had burned military stores. From the surrounding hills, the colonists watched the smoke. To them, it looked like the British were burning their town. Hundreds of militia began moving toward the North Bridge. The British soldiers guarding it were suddenly facing a much larger force. The situation changed in minutes. A force that had entered Concord expecting to search warehouses was now preparing to fight for its own escape. Shots were exchanged. The militia fired. The British took casualties. And then the British withdrew. The mission was finished. But not in the way Gage had planned. Smith now had a much bigger problem. He had to get his men back to Boston, and the road home was 18 miles long. At noon, the British began the retreat. Smith knew what he was doing. He organized the column according to military doctrine, a vanguard in front, A rear guard behind. Light infantry on the flanks. The flankers were supposed to move through the fields and prevent the militia from getting close enough to attack the main column. On paper, it was exactly what a professional army should do. But there was something the British formation could not control: the land. The road from Concord to Boston was not an open European battlefield. It was a maze of stone walls, farms, woods, orchards, hills, streams, and narrow roads. The colonists had grown up here. They knew where the road disappeared behind a hill. They knew which walls gave the best cover. They knew where the British would have to slow down, and now they were using all of it. At Meriam's corner, the first serious attacks began. Militia opened fire from behind walls and buildings. The British flankers pushed forward. The colonists pulled back. Then another group appeared somewhere else. The British would clear one position and be fired upon from another. The road itself was becoming a weapon, and this was the beginning of the real battle. The British were not facing one large force they could attack and destroy. They were facing hundreds of small groups that could appear, fire, disappear, and appear again somewhere farther down the road. For every position the British cleared, another seemed to take its place. For the British soldiers, the physical exhaustion was becoming just as dangerous as the bullets. They had been marching since the night before. Many had already fought at Lexington and Concord. The light infantry had spent hours running through fields and over walls, and ammunition was running low. Still, the column continued. The soldiers could not simply stop. Stopping meant allowing the militia to surround them. Moving meant exposing themselves to another volley. The British were trapped between two bad choices. Then came the bloody angle. The road narrowed between higher ground. Colonists took positions on both sides. The British column moved through the danger zone, while shots came from the surrounding cover. There was no single enemy formation to destroy. There was no battlefield line to break. The enemy kept disappearing, then appearing again. Fire, retreat, reload, fire again. The British could not force the colonists into one decisive battle, and that was the trap. The British were fighting an army they could rarely see. By the time the column reached Lexington again, the men were exhausted. Colonel Smith had been wounded. The light infantry were struggling to keep the militia away, and the retreat was beginning to lose its shape. Then Captain John Parker appeared again, the same man whose militia had been fired upon that morning. His men took positions overlooking the road. As the British approached, they opened fire. The soldiers pushed forward. But they were reaching the breaking point. The men who had marched into the countryside that morning as an elite force were now trying to escape it. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. Their officers were being wounded. The men had spent hours fighting through terrain that gave the militia every advantage, and there was still a long road ahead. Then something changed. The sound of artillery came from behind the British column. Reinforcements were coming. Brigadier General Hugh Percy was coming from Boston with roughly 1,000 fresh troops. And artillery! The cannons opened fire. The sound alone forced many of the pursuing militia to fall back. For Smith's exhausted soldiers, Percy was not just reinforcement. He was rescue. Without him, the expedition might have been destroyed on the road. But Percy had arrived late. Orders had gone out hours earlier. His brigade had not actually left Boston until much later. Now he had to take what remained of Smith's force and get it home. For the first time all day, the British had something they desperately needed: space. Percy's artillery kept the militia farther away. His fresh troops gave the exhausted soldiers from Smith's column a chance to reform. But Percy understood that he could not simply turn around and fight his way through the countryside. He needed to keep moving. The longer the British stayed outside Boston, the more militia would arrive, and the colonial forces were still growing. So the column began moving again. The retreat was not over. The worst fighting was still ahead. They entered Menotomy. Today, the area is Arlington. In 1775, it was a settlement filled with houses, barns, taverns, fences, stone walls, and narrow roads. For the militia, it was perfect. They could fire from cover at extremely close range, then disappear. The British responded with brutal force. The fighting became increasingly personal. Soldiers forced their way into houses from which they believed they were being fired upon. Militia fought at close quarters. Bayonets were used. Homes became battlefields. One of the bloodiest fights centered around the house of Jason Russell. Russell was an older farmer who had sent his family away for safety. He remained behind. When fighting reached his property, militia were caught near the house. British troops attacked. Russell was killed. The fighting continued around and inside the building. By the end, dozens of men were dead in the surrounding area. Menotomy became the bloodiest part of the entire day's fighting, and the British still had miles to go. Percy now faced one final decision. The road ahead split. One route led toward Cambridge, but the bridge had been destroyed and Colonial forces were waiting. The other route led toward Charlestown. Percy chose Charlestown. It was a crucial decision. The turn helped the British avoid another major ambush and gave the exhausted column a chance to reach safety. But even now, the militia did not stop. They followed. They fired from the surrounding countryside. They waited for another opportunity to cut the column off. The British had started the day believing they controlled the situation. Now their entire objective had changed. They were no longer trying to destroy weapons. They were no longer trying to punish the rebels. They were simply trying to reach the safety of Boston. Behind them, thousands of militia continued gathering. Ahead of them was the Charles River and the protection of British-held Boston. The British column finally reached Charlestown after sunset. The men who had marched out the previous night were no longer the same force. They had spent the entire day fighting. They had marched for miles. They had been shot at from behind walls, from hills, from houses, and from fields. And they had failed to accomplish the mission that had started the entire operation. They had gone out to destroy a colonial weapons stockpile. Instead, the countryside had nearly destroyed them. That is what made April 19th so important. The British were not annihilated. They were not defeated in a conventional battle. They were rescued. But something far more important had happened. The colonists had discovered that the British army could bleed. Professional soldiers could be exhausted. Elite infantry could be forced to retreat. And an army that controlled Boston could still be vulnerable the moment it entered the countryside. The British had expected a raid. They found a rebellion. They expected farmers to scatter. Instead, those farmers kept coming, not as one organized army, but from every road, every village, every farm. And for 18 miles, the British column was never allowed to forget that. One road, 18 miles, and an elite British force that entered Massachusetts believing it was the hunter, spent the entire journey home becoming the prey.